Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Intas Pharmaceutical Limited, I, Dr. Mithilesh Nayak, welcome you all to this 12th edition in the webinar series Practice Pulse in Endocrinology. So, a year ago in June 2020, we have started this journey of learning important concepts in the managing various endocrine disorders. Initially, we thought that it would be difficult to run this webinar series to such long, but under the apt guidance of Dr. Chaudhary, we are successful in conducting 11 sessions on 20 different concepts. And today, we are again live with two more interesting topics: endocrine manipulation in prostate and breast cancers, and interpretation of ABG reports. And to moderate today's session, we are having with us our course director, an eminent endocrinologist and researcher with more than 200 research papers to his credit, Dr. Subhankar Chaudhary sir. He is currently professor and head at Department of Endocrinology at SSKM Hospital, Kolkata. So with this, I hand over digital podium to Chaudhary sir. Over to you, sir.
Very good evening. A warm welcome once again to our physician friends across the country. And let's hope we have another edition of learning and sharing. It really sounds wonderful to me that we have had 11 very successful, very well participated sessions. And it's really heartening for me as an endocrinologist, as a teacher in endocrinology, to see so much of interest in the discipline of endocrinology. So we have covered different areas of endocrinology, from pediatric endocrinology, gynecologic endocrinology, metabolic bone diseases. Of course, thyroid was there. A little bit of diabetes was there. We talked about aging as well. We had a very lively debate as to whether hormones can delay, postpone aging. And this evening we have something of a mixture. The two topics are not quite related to each other, but both are important, and hopefully again it will draw a lot of attention and interest, and we'll have our usual lively interaction at the end. So we have, on the one hand, at least two cancers where there is significant impact of using hormones or drugs that would address directly hormones. So one is breast cancer, the other is prostate cancer. If we look at malignancy overall, of course, every malignancy is possibly dependent in a way on paracrine, endocrine, or autocrine factors. If we think of growth factors, they are definitely there, and there are very promising new drugs addressing various growth factors. But we won't go into the broad gamut of influence of hormones or growth factors on cancers, but we'll restrict this evening to two cancers where endocrine manipulation is very well accepted: breast cancer and prostate cancer. And to do the honors, we have none other than very dynamic Dr. Beatrice Ann, who is assistant professor in the Department of Endocrinology at the Nizam Institute of Medical Sciences in Hyderabad. And she has a wonderful career before her, and she's an editorial board member of the Indian Journal of Cardiovascular Disease in Women, and has several publications. So we have another very interesting topic, because these are COVID days. Most of us are directly or indirectly involved in COVID management, and almost invariably these patients tend to get arterial blood gas analysis done. And quite often as physicians, we struggle a little bit to sort of interpret those results. So we'll have, again, a very dynamic endocrinologist, Dr. Mohan Shenoy, who is from Trivandrum, Maybe we'll formally introduce him before his talk, but he will sort of teach us how to interpret, maybe not delve into great depths, which anyway we'll have intensivist or a nephrologist or a pulmonologist to help us, but he will definitely teach us how to interpret on a basic level. So first thing first, so we have Dr. Beatrice Ann to talk on endocrine manipulation of breast and prostate cancer.
Thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. A very good evening to all. It gives me great pleasure to be giving this talk under Professor Chowdhury, because I am his student, and sir not only taught me endocrinology, he also taught me my first words in Bengali, because the first day I entered the OPD during my DM. So sir asked me, do you know any Bengali? I said, sir, I don't know. So sir taught me the first word, Oshud means medicine. So I still remember that. And the learning still continues, because sir has given me a topic which I'm sure he knows that I have not read during DM days, and I've read now. So I'll be talking about an offbeat topic. It's an endocrine manipulation of breast and prostate cancers. So this is going to be the outline. I will talk about the prostate cancer first. I'll talk about the drugs which are being used, the side effects, and what is the endocrinologist or the physician's role. And then I'll be talking about breast cancer, what is hormone therapy in breast cancer, and what are the side effects. So first we'll go to prostate cancer, hormone therapy. So this is basically a gist of the steroid synthetic pathway and how androgens are synthesized in the adrenals as well as the testes. So we have the stimulation by the pituitary, the LH for the testicular androgen production, the ACTH for the adrenal androgen production. So we have the delta 5 pathway, which is responsible primarily for the synthesis of androgens. The majority of it is testosterone, and testosterone is in circulation bound to SHBG, CBG, and albumin. And then it acts locally at the level of the prostate, where testosterone is converted to its active form, that is dihydrotestosterone by 5-alpha reductase, of which there are two isoforms. 5-alpha 2 reductase type 2 isoform is what is commonly seen in the prostate, but we have even the type 1 isoform in prostate CA. And this is the pathway that is mediated by 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 2, which inactivates these steroids. So possible areas where we could intervene, one is at the level of the pituitary, and the other is at the level of the androgen receptors in the target organs. So this is again a pictorial representation of what are the drugs used in prostate CA, the hormones in fact. And see, we have here at the level of the pituitary, the GnRH agonist, which is leuprolide, goserelin, triptorelin, histrelin, and GnRH antagonist, that is degarelix, and estrogen, which was used historically, diethylstilbestrol was used, but it was found to have increased CV mortality. And since we have better agents now, we don't use estrogens anymore. And the other option is at the level of the testis, where we have surgical castration, which is usually indicated when we want an immediate decrease in the testosterone, as in spinal cord compression. The other option is medical castration, where we have the androgen receptor directed therapy, flutamide and bicalutamide, which are basically the first generation anti-androgens, and nilotinib and enzalutamide and apalutamide, which are all the second generation androgen receptor blockers. And another agent of interest is the 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like finasteride, which are being tried in the prevention of prostate CA. They did prevent it, but if patients develop prostate CA on these 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, they were found to be of a more malignant phenotype. Hence, it is a controversial area, and it's still not clear whether these agents can be used safely in the prevention. So, in order to understand the hormone therapy in prostate CA, we need to classify this prostate CA into castration-sensitive prostate CA and castration-resistant prostate CA, because the treatment is going to be different. So, the castration-sensitive prostate CA, the primary agent will be androgen deprivation therapy, which is GnRH agonists like goserelin, leuprolide, buserelin, histrelin, and triptorelin. The most commonly used agent is leuprolide. and they are long-acting drugs. And what happens is there's going to be continuous stimulation of the GnRH receptors, which are present in the pituitary, which is going to cause desensitization, and thereby there is going to be a reduction in the testosterone levels. But initially what happens is there is going to be an initial stimulation of the pituitary, and there is going to be an increase in the LH, and thereby there is going to be also an increase in the testosterone. This is called as the initial flare effect. So which sometimes can be counterproductive, because especially in patients who have spinal cord compression, it can increase bone pain, and it can lead to ureteral blockage. So in order to overcome this effect, we have the combined androgen blockade, which is basically GnRH agonists plus anti-androgens. Anti-androgens are given for 2 weeks, and then the GnRH agonists are continued. And within 3 to 4 weeks, we have castrate levels of serum testosterone, which is defined as levels less than or equal to 50 nanogram per dl. And in an intermittent or a continuous ADT has been tried, because we know that androgen deprivation therapy has its own side effects. So intermittent therapy has been tried. This is basically you give androgen deprivation therapy for some time and then take the patient off the treatment, follow up with the prostate specific androgen levels. And when they shoot up anywhere between 10 to 20, you restart the therapy. This is to just overcome the side effects. But what has been shown is that the survival is better with the continuous ADT. And we have the GnRH antagonists. This is Degarelix, which is a monthly injection, and Relugolix, which is oral daily tablets. And this, the advantage of this is that it's going to avoid the flare phenomenon, and because they are going to be directly antagonists, and studies have shown longer progression-free survival, and studies versus GnRH agonists have shown that they have lower overall mortality rates, and they also have fewer CV events. But in spite of all these effects, we still prefer GnRH agonists, because GnRH antagonists, for one, they have more injection site reactions, the incidence of which is almost 40%. And so the patients do not tend to discontinue it. And we do have more studies with the GnRH agonists. So the preferred therapy right now, and the most commonly used therapy right now, is going to be the GnRH agonists. So what are the side effects? Probably starting GnRH agonists or antagonists or androgen receptor blockers probably is done by our oncology colleagues, and probably there we don't have to make a decision. But what we need to know about these drugs is the side effects. So patients can come to us with these side effects, especially during the COVID times, especially because patient may not be able to reach the oncologist, and the patients are on this therapy, and the patients may come back to us with the side effects. So we need to know how to tackle these issues. Patients can have sexual dysfunction. Usually after starting the ADT, we have loss of libido, and which is followed by erectile dysfunction. So the couples need to be counseled about this. And osteoporosis and bone fractures, which is a very important side effect, and I'll be talking about more in detail. Vasomotor symptoms, just like we have postmenopausal ladies when the estrogen is taken off, and then they have the vasomotor symptoms. Just like that, we have even for the males, which can be managed with venlafaxine, megestrol, estrogen, and gabapentin. We need to remember the side effects of these drugs as well. Venlafaxine can cause dry mouth. Megestrol can cause an increase in the appetite, and it can cause weight gain. And estrogen, of course, can cause gynecomastia. And these drugs, the ADT, can also cause sarcopenic obesity. There's going to be increase in the subcutaneous fat accumulation. There is going to be a loss in the muscle mass. And thereby, there's going to be an increase in the incidence of diabetes and dyslipidemia as well. So we need to screen these patients and always counsel these patients about lifestyle measures. And CV events in studies have shown to be a little higher, especially in those with pre-existing disease. And this risk is found to be lower in the GnRH antagonists. And some case reports are there with even prolongation of QT or QTC interval when patients are on ADT. And thromboembolic events have been reported. Acute kidney injury is we are not very certain about it, because there were confounding factors when this was studied in patients with ADT, because patients also had ureteral blockade, patients were also on bisphosphonates. So we really cannot say for sure that these agents can cause acute kidney injury as of now. Fatigue is again a very common side effect in these patients. Anemia, which is mild to moderate, normocytic and normochromic, and usually responds to erythropoietin. And gynecomastia, which can be managed by tamoxifen or prophylactic radiation therapy. And these agents work when the patient, when they are given before the patient develops gynecomastia, not after. The response may not be so good. And decreased testicular size, again, which can be having an effect on the males. Thinning of body hair and cognitive changes, again, Alzheimer's dementia is found to be more in these patients with who are on ADT, and anxiety and depression again are found to be more common. Osteoporosis, again, which is a very important side effect of androgen deprivation therapy. There is loss of BMD after 6 to 9 months of ADT, and fractures can occur in up to 20% of the patients within 5 years. So we need to document a baseline BMD in all these patients where we are planning to start ADT. And we need to focus on lifestyle modification, smoking cessation, and to moderate the alcohol intake and caffeine, vitamin D 800 IU per day, and calcium supplementation of around 1000 to 1200 milligram per day, and exercise, of course. So what are the indications for therapy in these patients? Conventional indications, where you look at the BMD, you have a T-score of less than minus 2.5, or a FRAX score which shows a 10-year probability of hip fracture of more than or equal to 3%, and combined osteoporotic fractures of more than equal to 20%, then you need to start these patients on therapy. Other indications are T-score less than minus 2 or T-score more than minus 2 with any 2 risk factors, that is age more than 65 years, or the T-score is less than minus 1.5 if the patient is a smoker, be it current or past. The BMI is less than 24 if the patient has a family history of hip fracture, or a personal history of fragility fracture above age of 50 years, or the patient has had a history of oral glucocorticoid use for more than 6 months. So the agent which has been studied well and is accepted is denosumab is the first choice. We give 60 milligrams subcutaneous every 6 months, or the other alternative will be zoledronic acid 5 milligram once a year. The other bisphosphonates have not been studied in detail, and best response is with zoledronic acid. And a duration of therapy is for the duration of endocrine therapy or up to 5 years. And in castration-resistant prostate CA, we need to, especially with skeletal metastasis, we need to give the metastatic dose. That is, we need to give a higher dose. So denosumab is given 120 milligrams subcutaneous every 4 weeks, and zoledronic acid is given as a 4 milligram IV infusion every 3 to 4 weeks. But unfortunately, longer duration of therapy has been found to have an increased incidence of jaw osteonecrosis. So the experts recommend discontinuation of osteoclast inhibitors after 12 doses. So we'll go to the other therapy which has been used, that is anti-androgens. So the anti-androgens, we have the first generation and the second generation. So the enzalutamide, apalutamide are all androgen receptor blockers, which are the recent additions, the second generation. Abiraterone is basically an androgen, it inhibits the androgen synthesis. So it basically inhibits the 1720 lyase and the 17-alpha hydroxylase. So patients who are on abiraterone are going to have effects just like somebody who has a 17-alpha hydroxylase deficiency. So what happens is the steroid precursors are channeled more towards the synthesis of aldosterone and less towards the cortisol as well as the androgen pathway. So we can have hypertension, we can have hypokalemia, and there is going to be an increase in the ACTH, which is going to drive further increase in the aldosterone. So generally abiraterone is given with prednisolone so that the ACTH drive is blocked and we do not have too much of hypertension or hypokalemia because of the increased aldosterone. So these agents are used both in metastatic as well as non-metastatic castration-resistant prostate CA. So this is a diagrammatic representation of how these androgen receptor blockers work and the difference between the first generation and the second generation androgen receptor blockers. So the first generation is bicalautamide. So what happens is it binds to the ligand binding domain of the androgen receptor. It allows the translocation of the androgen receptor to the nucleus. And instead of activating the co-activators, it activates the co-repressors. So the end organ effects are not there. So this is how bicalautamide works. On the other hand, the second generation androgen receptors, they are going to not allow even the translocation of the androgen receptors to the nucleus. Thereby what happens is, if in bicalautamide use, sometimes there can be other pathways, since already the androgen receptor is already in the nucleus, there can be activation of other pathways, and thereby it can turn into a partial agonist. So this is overcome by the use of drugs like enzalutamide, which do not allow the translocation of the androgen receptor to the nucleus. So the side effects of androgen receptor blockers, CNS toxicity has been reported, especially seizures, which is found to be more with enzalutamide compared to apalutamide, compared to darolutamide. And there is also an increased risk of falls and fractures, which has been recorded with enzalutamide. Fatigue, again, is a common side effect. So this is a gist of how the oncologist manage prostate CA, depending on whether it is a biochemical recurrence or whether it's locally advanced or metastatic disease. So this may be a little difficult. So this is a more simplified version for us. So hormone sensitive disease, we use LHRH, basically GnRH agonist or antagonist, which is basically the androgen deprivation therapy or medical castration. And in spite of castrate levels of testosterone, that is less than 50 nanogram per DL, we still have PSA progression. Then it means that it has gone into castration resistant prostate CA. So non-metastatic, we do have choices like apalutamide and enzalutamide. And metastatic, we have other options, which includes also chemotherapeutic agents. So this is about prostate CA. Now we'll go on to breast cancer, that is hormone therapy here. And a few words about breast cancer. As you all know, that it is the most frequently diagnosed cancer in the world. And this is the difference between breast and prostate CA, because we have a screening program in place for breast CA, whereas in prostate CA, we do not have screening programs. And that is the reason we find patients with more advanced disease when they come to us with prostate CA as compared to breast CA. And 75% of cases are ER/PR positive in breast CA. And the choice of hormone therapy here in breast CA depends mainly on the menopausal status. And less than 1/3 of the women with breast CA are premenopausal. And how do we define menopause? It is anybody with any lady with more than 60 years, we can assume to be in menopause, or less than 60 years who has previously undergone bilateral oophorectomy and no menstrual cycles for more than equal to 12 months, if the patient is not on tamoxifen or chemotherapy or any ovarian suppression agents, and the serum estradiol is in the post-menopausal range. Or if the patient is amenorrheic on tamoxifen, but still the FSH and estradiol levels are in the post-menopausal range, we do take them as post-menopausal. This is important to distinguish because the treatment is going to be different in these two categories of patients. So in post-menopausal women with ER/PR positive breast cancer, aromatase inhibitors are preferred over tamoxifen because the most common source here is going to be peripheral conversion. So we have anastrozole, we have letrozole, we have exemestane, which are the agents used. And exemestane is an analog of androstenedione, and it is steroidal inactivator. And we have, this is actually causes irreversible binding. And non-steroidal inhibitors are letrozole and anastrozole. And AI versus, that is aromatase inhibitors versus tamoxifen, there's found to be lesser recurrence and lower breast CA mortality in patients who are on aromatase inhibitors, especially in the postmenopausal status. And generally in the first 5 years, we do prefer to give the aromatase inhibitors because that is the time when you're going to have maximum recurrence. So better to give the aromatase inhibitors in this period. And if the patient has any side effects to one aromatase inhibitor, you can always switch over to the other one. So what are the side effects? Again, this is something that we need to know because patients may be taking this and patients may be coming to us with these side effects. So the common one is AI-associated musculoskeletal syndrome, basically bone pains, joint pains, muscle pains, body aches, and which is tackled by, we advise the patient to do exercise, which is basically the same that we advise for patients with diabetes, which is 150 minutes of exercise per week and two sessions of muscle strengthening exercises in a week. And it doesn't come down, we will give them NSAIDs. Or the other option would be to temporarily discontinue the AI for 2 to 8 weeks and probably start later with another AI. Duloxetine can be given 30 to 60 milligram daily to counter these effects. Acupuncture again is another option. And if none of these work, then probably we need to switch to tamoxifen. The others, of course, is sexual dysfunction, hot flashes, and we can manage this with SSRIs. The advantage here is that aromatase inhibitors do not have any drug interaction with SSRI like tamoxifen, where tamoxifen has to be converted to its active form, and SSRI inhibits or interfere with the conversion here. And cognitive problems, especially poor sleep hygiene, depression, hair thinning, which can be managed with minoxidil local application. And there is found to be an increased risk of CV disease, diabetes, and hypercholesterolemia. But the good news is that they do have lower risk of venous thrombosis, endometrial CA, and fatty liver disease compared to tamoxifen. And this again is an important aspect, that is AI-induced bone loss. So before starting therapy, we need to do BMT by DEXA for all the patients. We need to calculate the FRAX score, but we need to remember that FRAX score does not fully capture the AI-induced bone loss. And we need to do biochemical profile, look at the calcium, the phosphorus, the 25-hydroxyvitamin D. If it's low, which it needs to be supplemented. And start with non-pharmacologic approach, that is supplement vitamin D at least 800 to 1000 IU per day, calcium up to 1200 milligram per day, avoid smoking, and moderation of alcohol intake. So when do we start pharmacotherapy? When there is osteoporosis, the conventional thing, that is T-score of less than -2.5 or history of regenerative fracture. And if the T-score is between -1 to -2.5, then we should calculate the FRAX score. But when calculating the FRAX score, we need to tick the column with rheumatoid arthritis, because it has been found that the incidence of fractures in these patients on AI are as high as those patients who have rheumatoid arthritis. And all patients with a T-score of less than -2 or less than -1.5 with one additional risk factor. Risk factors are the same risk factors which are there in the FRAX score. Or with more than or equal to 2 risk factors without BMD, you can still start therapy for the duration of the AI treatment. And bisphosphonates are preferred over denosumab here. And if oral drugs, alendronate, risedronate can be given weekly, or zoledronic acid can be given 4 milligram IV every 6 months. So this is about the postmenopausal women. In premenopausal women with ER/PR positive breast cancer, tamoxifen is given in those patients with a low to average risk. And those patients with high risk in the sense they have pathologically involved lymph nodes, or they have more invasion, and they have high risk of recurrence based on genomic assay, or who is a candidate for chemotherapy basically, or any patient who is less than 35 years. So these are all high risk patients, and we need to give ovarian function suppression or ablation with an aromatase inhibitor or tamoxifen. And ovarian function suppression can be done either with a GnRH agonist or oophorectomy or radiation. And GnRH agonists again used here are goserelin, leuprolide, and triptorelin. And the side effects of these is that basically they can have musculoskeletal symptoms, and they can have typical postmenopausal symptoms. So they can have hot flashes, they can have BMD loss, they can have an increased risk of CV disease. So the problem with radiating the ovaries, so even however hard we try, sometimes there is a risk of radiation to even normal tissues like the bowels. So we need to know about the side effects of tamoxifen. It can cause hot flashes, it can cause ocular effects, because tamoxifen has binds the polar lipids, and there can be drug accumulation in the retina and thereby cause this retinal toxicity. And they can also cause chloride channel blockage in the lens, and there's been found to be an increased incidence of cataract in these patients who are on tamoxifen. And thromboembolic events again are found to be are noted in these patients. And uterine malignancies like endometrial cancer and uterine sarcoma can be detected even after 6 years after discontinuation of tamoxifen. Fertility consideration again is important in the premenopausal lady. So even if the patient is on tamoxifen, sometimes there can be recovery of the ovarian function, and patients need to advise the contraception. We need to advise patients for contraception. And after stopping tamoxifen, we need to wait for 2 months before attempting pregnancy, because tamoxifen is teratogenic. And for those patients who are planning pregnancy in the future, ovarian tissue cryopreservation for fertility preservation is an option. So a word or two about male breast cancer. So these patients with hormone receptor positive male breast cancer, we tend to give them tamoxifen. And if there are any contraindications to tamoxifen like hypercoagulability, then we will give them a GnRH analog with an aromatase inhibitor. So this brings us to the end of the talk, and thank you all for patient listening. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Beatrice. That was indeed a fairly thorough coverage, and of course, we do not claim ourselves to be oncologists, and many of the treatment may be supervised by oncologists, but since we are manipulating hormones or the hormone effects, I think we as endocrinologists should also be aware, and as physicians also, we should be aware of the possibilities of these treatments, and also equally important, the side effects arising therefrom. So we will now shift gears. Sorry, we will now shift gears, and we've already mentioned Dr. Mohan Shenoy as being a wonderful, dynamic endocrinologist who is consultant at Sri Gokulam Medical College in Trivandrum. He is editorial board member of Thyroid Research and Practice and reviewer of many journals, including our own Indian Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism. He has written chapters in ESI Manual of Endocrinology. He has got various research interests, especially HCV-related metabolic syndrome and pediatric endocrinology. So we will now look at Dr. Mohan Shenoy to sort of take us through the slightly difficult journey of interpreting an arterial blood gas analysis. Over to Dr. Mohan.
Thank you, sir, for the great opportunity. Thank you for the kind introduction. I hope the screen is visible and I think I'm audible as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. So we are going to discuss a topic called interpretation of ABG report. Of course, I don't have any disclosures to make because I'm not part of the ABG machine company. So the procedure for ABG we all know, because the last many decades we have been in the medical school, and some doctors may have taught us regarding exactly the right way to do. I'm not here to tell you, but still we should remember that we should always interpret it correctly. So first step is to ensure that it is taken correctly as well. So it's an arterial blood gas drawn from the artery, and basically it is an invasive procedure. And there is a caution because the people on anticoagulants we will actually exercise a bit of restraint on need for repeated this thing to avoid invasive procedures. It's also a condition we also want to infer regarding the oxygen deficiency states, and we want to interpret whether it is primarily a ventilatory issue or primarily a metabolic acid-based anomalies. So when is it indicated? Because before you order this test, we should know whether it's indicated or not, because we have to interpret with the clinical scenarios. So first is to establish a diagnosis and the preoperative parameters when we have a condition which involves the cardiorespiratory events. Next, regarding the ventilatory status, when we have a person admitted in the ICU, when we want to know the oxygenation and acid-base status, definitely we all know that the nursing professional medical students are more involved assigned in the acute areas in the COVID times, and definitely encountering the ABG results which are tricky will not be an easy task. So next, regarding the guiding of treatment plan, because we know the response to intervention needs serial ABGs, so there is a struggle regarding interpretation sometimes, whether it is a complicated compensated types. So we have to interpret the basic physiology and have a step-by-step approach. So finally, the regulating of the electrolyte therapy in conditions like diabetic ketoacidosis is a very important condition in our endocrine practice. Finally, to also establish that we have gone through them in the right way. So I would like to spend the next 3 minutes on introduction on the body and the blood and the pH. We all know that there is a lot of hydrogen ions in the circulation. The pH is a measurement of the acidity or the alkalinity of the blood. So we all know the blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45. Extracellular fluid is actually 7.4. So the conditions which are compatible for life have to be between 6.8 and 8. So the acidotic pH means the pH is below 7.35, and alkalosis means it is above 7.45. So this is a diagram from Davidson textbook. We are seeing this. So the 6.8 to 8 is the range which definitely it is compatible with survival, because the cardiac function, respiratory function, and the CNS function depend on the normal physiological methods. So another slide regarding the same concept, and we see here that carbonic acid, even 1 unit here, can be notorious to shift it towards the 6.9 and below, whereas 20 units of bicarbonate itself can be important to shift it to the alkalosis side, which is the highlight regarding the role of bicarbonate buffers in the electrolyte and acid-base balance. So coming to the interpretation of an ABG report, my topic proper. So I would like you to just focus on the points which are seen here in the slide. pH, PCO2 and PO2 are the ones which are definitely in the first part. But remember that acid-base status always requires the bicarbonate level also to be taken into consideration. And arterial blood gas and venous blood gas have almost similar bicarbonate. That's also a point to be noted. Oxygenation tissue is actually made out by the oxygen saturation as per the ABG report, the bicarbonate status again, as well as the PO2 status. So we'll see a report here. Recently, I had seen a person on 13th of July, and this is the usual reports, and I usually make it a point to also mention the liters of oxygen that the person is receiving in the top part. So arterial sample is mentioned from the machine, but still we have to check the authenticity. I will tell you in the step-by-step approach. System name is mentioned, system ID is there. Patient ID often comes in, which will be filled correctly. Ensure that we are also seeing it serially as well. So please pin the number according to serial number as well. So acid-base level has got various banners. This is the co-oximetry manner. We also see that modern oximeters also include the FCO2HB and the different hemoglobinopathies as well in them. Accuracy is dependent on the type of machine. This is a Siemens machine. We are seeing here also the electrolyte levels mentioned here, but they may not be definitely accurate enough like the serum levels. So we can see here also includes the THBA, which is the patient's hemoglobin, because this is required to calculate the oxygen content of the blood. So if the hemoglobin is low, definitely the oxygen content will also be definitely low because of the oxygen carrying capacity. The machine directly measures the pH, PCO2 and PO2, whereas the calculated measurements are the bicarbonate and the oxygen saturation usually. So coming to the normal ABG values. So here I have put a right side a table here. The pH is 7.35 to 7.45. Just keep it in your mind. This is the normal values we usually expect. And you can also see here the most commonly used and relatively reliable parameter is the partial pressure of oxygen, or PaO2. The Pa is small and the other can also be PO2 as well. If it is a capital A, it means the alveolar oxygen. It is calculated by another formula for respiratory quotient. So here some units in some hospitals, some machines also employ is units in kilopascal. So converting it by units in kilopascal into 7.5 is equal to units in millimeter of mercury. Some machines which are imported also have some other measurements like torr values as well. So a rough calculation for this according to the age group is 105 minus the age in years divided by 2. Of course, it is not accurate, but there is an underestimation, and that's why it is not recommended usually in the common clinical practice. So I already mentioned regarding the venous blood gas. So the venous blood gas has the same bicarbonate level as the arterial blood, but note that the oxygen levels is always better in the arterial blood. So when we are students, definitely we may have been told that this blood is not arterial, this is venous. So this is based on this table. And this is showing you in a beautiful manner the way in which we are definitely reference arterial blood gas values is taken from again Harrison textbook. So ABE, or the actual BE mentioned here, is the amount of base needed to be added or removed from a liter of blood to bring it back to 7.4 at the degree of temperature and the oxygen PCO2 of 40. Don't worry about that. In a nutshell, it is the base excess is the value of bicarbonate above the normal value of 24 millimole per liter. So it's actually the additional value of base is available. So we all know there is also different buffer systems in different parts of the body. Nephrologist usually manages the renal part, but definitely we have to know extracellular fluid. The major buffer is the bicarbonate. Again, the blood. Also remember the blood also has hemoglobin as the major buffer. And minor buffers include the plasma proteins and the phosphate buffer system. Intercellular fluid, the major buffers are not the bicarbonate. It is the proteins and phosphate. And urine, the major buffers are ammonia and phosphate. Clinical importance is that 60% of the buffer systems are intracellular and 40% are extracellular. Respiratory acid is mostly buffered intracellular manner, and this is why proteins and phosphates are very important. Metabolic acid mostly buffered by extracellular manner, which is by the bicarbonate buffer. So the acid-base disorders are classified by the 1965 classification of Ad Hoc Committee of New York Academy of Sciences. Just as you can see a very common diagram which you can pick up. Acidosis is the abnormal process or condition where lower arterial pH, which without any compensation, secondary response. Primarily, simple acid-base disorders are a single direct straightforward primary etiologies are there. Mixed are the ones which are often difficult to be properly interpreted, and alkalemia I already told is pH more than 7.44 or 7.45 to be sure. So again, a formula called Henderson-Hasselbalch equation has to be mentioned because this is one of the major ways in which we have modified the system to include the mixed acid-base disorders. A practical approach to this has been given. This includes the pH, the pKa, the logarithm. So this is all requiring of various parameters picked up from the blood equations. So till now, I have discussed regarding the introductory part. So let me just go take you through the interpretation of ABG report. So I don't want to confuse you. I want all of you to take a piece of paper or a computer in front of you because it will be a very excited journey as well. So you all must have been familiar with the tic-tac-toe grid. So similarly, we can just see here the left side, the red side is the acidosis, the middle column is the normal value, and side part is the alkalosis. We'll slowly try to figure out how we can include one by one in this picture. For this, I have referred through a couple of important publications as well as I already mentioned the Harrison textbook and Davidson. These are all authentic textbooks. If at all I have made a mistake, you are free to point it out in the discussion part. So this is the CME. This is the main part of the discussion. So if you have a phone, you can just take a screenshot because it's very useful for you in the approach manner. 6-step approach to ABG interpretation. First thing is that review the patient because we have to examine the clues for the type of disturbances and don't just see without seeing the patient, the oxygen patient is receiving. So second step is to analyze the oxygenation status, looking for hypoxia like PaO2 and saturation of O2. Third step is the pH because once you assess the person is really active, then you can set the pH, determining the acid balance, whether pH is acidemic or alkalemic. Step 4 is assessing the respiratory disturbances. This is for the alveolar ventilation, so capital A, evaluating the PaCO2. Next, step 5 is assessing the metabolic disturbances. I already told that metabolic parameters are very important to assess the compensation process. Sixth one, once you have examined all the above steps, we have to assign them into a mixed or compensatory processes. So this is why I told you take a piece of paper. So pH is in the left side, middle part is PaCO2, lower part is bicarbonate. So objective is to include in the correct box. So once you have placed a value in the box, it will be easy to interpret. So for example, the pH is 7.43. Here we can put in the normal range. PaCO2 is a normal blood gas. So just to show you, familiar with it, the PaO2 is 85, again in the normal range. We can see PaCO2 is 42, it's a normal range. So this comes in the middle zone of our picture. So we'll examine in the practice session also. So first step I mentioned is check the consistency of the report. So sometimes the labs make error. So the hydrogen concentration may not be correct. So there is a value by which we can subtract the value. The normal range is here seeing 80. So we minus the value of the here from the 80. So this is how we calculate the exact value. So if we have a person with diabetic ketoacidosis, pH of 7.20, PaCO2 of 30, bicarbonate of 15, this means that we have to value of 7.20. So we should minus the 80 from 80. So it is 60. So here we have to arrive with this. So this is how the hydrogen plus ions from this table we are calculating here. So hydrogen plus ions multiplied by bicarbonate divided by the PaCO2. This is how we just know whether it is a true value or not. So sometimes fake values available. Some persons can fake the results, which is why we have to know this person had a value of value mentioned as 30 in this PaCO2, but actually this report is wrong because we expect this value, the combination ratio to be 24. This is the machine derived value, the constant value has to be 24. Sometimes there may be labs which give the value wrong, which is why we have to take care of this as well. Another method is adding the PaCO2 plus adding the PaCO2, and when it comes to near to 140, it means it is nearly the normal. So again, it is true when the person is breathing air, not ventilation. It is greater means that the analysis contains an error, some oxygen bubbles are there. If it is less means that the lung is impaired. So this is why we also have to check the authenticity of the report before we go into the steps. So already mentioned regarding the clinical history, metabolic acidosis is characterized in various conditions like diabetes, renal failure. The clues for which are hypotension, diarrhea, metformin consumption, lactic acidosis, alcoholism. In metabolic alkalosis, the picture can be vomiting, the Ryle's tube aspiration, the clue of hypovolemia, bicarbonate administration exorbitantly, or the hypokalemia compared in the postoperative paralytic ileus. Respiratory acidosis is made out in the conditions like COPD, muscular weakness, and postoperative conditions again. Finally, the respiratory alkalosis is made out with the patient in tachycardia, tachypnea, then hepatic coma in chronic liver disease, as well as in widespread sepsis. So this is the first step to establish the diagnosis. We should know the history of the person. Second step is to assess the oxygenation. We look at the oxygen status, whether he's breathing, the saturation is maintaining on room air. So oxygen status is judged by the PaCO2, but we also know we should also know that there is ventilation patient receiving order 100. We should minus it. We should know the FiO2 as well. So the expected PO2 is generally 5 times that of the FiO2 multiplied by 5. We classify it as mild, moderate, or severe hypoxia depending on the grade of the PaO2. Third step is to check the pH. So the pH in the report, if it is less than 7.35, it suggests it is acidemia is present. If it is more than 7.45, alkalemia is present. I mentioned acidemia because it is mentioned in the blood level. Acidosis is mentioned in the tissue level because acidosis is the pathological process which causes acidemia. Acidosis can have low pH, normal pH, or elevated pH depending on the level of the compensation. The fourth step is the checking of the PCO2. So this is the tic-tac-toe again. If the pH value is in the lower side acidosis, higher side is alkalosis. We are seeing here when CO2 is there, respiratory value, PCO2 is more than 45, it is respiratory, and the PCO2 is less than 35, it is metabolic. So we remember that metabolic and respiratory are also, if pH and PCO2 are moving in the opposite direction, it is primarily a respiratory problem. This is why you can see here that when pH is less than 7.35 and PCO2 is less than 40, it denotes that it is here. It's coming in the value of metabolic acidosis range. If pH is less than 7.35 and PCO2 is more than 40, which is the case here, it comes to the respiratory acidosis. So very simple. Again, the same is for the respiratory alkalosis as well. So mnemonic is there because I am a big fan of mnemonics, because we all have been used to seeing the Rome. The Colosseum of Rome is one of the 7 wonders of the world. The simple mnemonic mentioned is the Rome. So respiratory opposite, which means that respiratory compromise, and we are seeing that when PCO2 is down, which means it is alkalosis, and PCO2 is up, it suggests acidosis. In metabolic counterpart, it is equal, which means that when pH is up, both sides are normal, equally coming up. So which is why equal means it is alkalosis. So this is very simple diagram. We're also seeing here in a person sitting on a swing, if both are together, it is metabolic. So I hope the first part is clear to all. So I will also focus on the next part is the primary acid-base disorders. So primary acid-base disorders based on the values as already told to you. We also include values like this. So as already mentioned, the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation composes the disturbances either the respiratory component or the metabolic component, and this diagram. So we will go to the flow chart here. So pH is less, which means acidotic. Metabolic means the HCO3 is less, PCO2 is also less. The bicarbonate here we are seeing is higher in the respiratory as well as in the carbon dioxide. And simplifying here again, the respiratory alkalosis opposite we are seeing here, and the metabolic side is coming equal side. So let me teach you a few rules of compensation before I go into the sixth step. So the rules of compensation is that the response depends on the functioning of the organ system, also on the severity of the acid-base balance. Acute compensation occurs within 6 to 24 hours, and chronic compensation occurs within 1 to 4 days. Respiratory compensation occurs faster than metabolic. Actually, I told you regarding opposite. Again, it occurs faster as well. And it is complete compensation is often uncommon, which is why when you're given a question like that, definitely we have to be less suspect on that. So the step 5 in this regard is regarding calculation of compensation. So when a primary acid-base disorder exists, the body attempts to return to pH via the other half of the acid base. So this case, metabolic acidosis, the compensatory response is to decrease it by decreasing the carbon dioxide level, so it will become respiratory compromise. So metabolic alkalosis, the opposite side, so again is respiratory will be. So it is a very simple way in which we can calculate. We should understand the basic compensatory mechanism. So this is why we should remember that when the renal problem is there, the lung will try to compensate. So adequate compensation is, again, there is a formula for you. It is called the Winter's formula for metabolic acidosis. So compensation formula is the value of carbon dioxide should be 1.5 times the bicarbonate plus 8. So again, if you have a phone, we can just take a photo or we can see it in reference later on in the YouTube link. Metabolic alkalosis, another formula by which PCO2 is equal to 0.9 multiply the bicarbonate plus 16. So these are all age-derived long-term studies have been done in this by statistics as well, which is why this formula is very useful for us in the clinical practice. Respiratory acidosis, the formula combination is for every 10 increase in the PCO2, the bicarbonate increase compensation is 1 in case of acute and 4 in case of chronic. And case in the respiratory alkalosis, need not mug it up. For every 10 increase, we have the decrease in the bicarbonate by 2 in acute and 4 in chronic. So for summary here, uncompensated means straightforward we are seeing here, and metabolic. So this is how usually we have to interpret. When you have a normal compensated response, this is how I also showed. This also can be useful for your practice to remember. Respiratory acidosis, usually we see a compensation in this way in this picture. Coming to the anion gap is the next concept. Anion gap is the unmeasured anions in the plasma. Basically the proteins like plasma, the proteins albumin, phosphate, lactate, unmeasured values like lactate, these are all mentioned here. So again the formula is sodium value minus the chloride plus bicarbonate. So we don't take the values from the ABG, we try to derive from the serum in the value of the plasma. So normal values 10 to 12. And there is also something called albumin corrected anion gap, just like the calcium also has correction. Observed anion gap plus 2.5 multiplied by 4.5 minus the measured albumin is very simple and easy to interpret. Another thing, in various conditions like mixed anion gap, we also calculate the delta ratio or gap ratio of the anion gap and the bicarbonate deficit. Anion gap minus 12 divided by 24 minus bicarbonate. Again, this is a very useful condition to calculate whether there is a pre-existing conditions or any mixed condition or any uncomplicated high anion gap metabolic acidosis. So a normal anion gap acidosis is seen in conditions like GI losses, renal tubular acidosis, hyperkalemia, various drugs, and this is why another mnemonic by the term of hard up is there. So endocrine potpourri is the name of symposium. The 4 endocrine conditions which are very commonly encountered in ABG's order are diabetic ketoacidosis, renal tubular acidosis, Addison's crisis, in which we have got some high normal anion gap acidosis, as well as metabolic alkalosis seen in Cushing syndrome. One case scenario for you, after which we will go to the practice sessions. This is a person, a 2-year-old male, presented to us with inability to walk since 1 year. So the body weight was low and unable to walk or stand at 10 months. So we are seeing the baseline labs of normal value of sodium. Potassium is a bit lower side. Of course, appears to have a frontal bossing, pot belly. Classic picture of rickets is there. Received calcitriol on alternate days. Elemental calcium also. The why I am saying in this condition is ABG is very useful in this condition. Calcium profile or bone picture is seen. High alkaline phosphorus. Intact pitches is normal. Phosphate is very low. This is a classic case of hypophosphatemic rickets. The arterial blood gas analysis typically shows normal anion gap this acidosis, and which is why it's very important to work up when you have a person like this. And this is a case which has been documented in clinical history and in the journals as dense disease. And I won't take you through that, but to just show you the picture where endocrine practitioners also have patients walking to us when we do ABG in clinical practice. This person also needs to be known as urine anion gap is also useful. It's the measure to calculate the renal or extrarenal deficits. Negative urine gap is in the GI losses. Normal value is 30 to 50. So errors are also there. Typically, a good sample care is required. When we discard a sample for prolonged periods at room temperature, the value can erroneously be there. Gas diffusion can lead to low PaO2. Heparin, if added to syringe, it can increase sometimes. The acidic pH is there, and then we can see that falsely low PaO2 can be seen if inadequately dismissed, which is why correctly mixing the arterial sample with anticoagulant in 2 dimensions prevents the stacking of the RBCs. Another source of error is by air bubbles. If air bubbles are exceeding the blood volume, it can also cause a high value of PaO2 and a false value of PaCO2 low value. And some conditions may not reflect in states of shock when there is a peripheral tissues and a systemic errors. They may not reflect the tissue levels. So I think I have taken you through some useful, with the permission of the chair, can I just take some practice questions as well?
Yes, let's have.
Okay.
Them. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, sir. So the first case we have, I hope you have the tic-tac-toe with you as well, the audience here. So I don't want to take you again to that. So this is the case here, 47-year-old male who sustained a head injury. Glasgow Coma scale is often useful in monitoring. It is 8. And of course, the neurosurgeon is managing it. So we have been called here with the pH of 7.31. PaCO2 is 59. Bicarbonate is 35. So your job here is to match the options. If you can type it in the chat box, it is good. Otherwise, also if you can tell me in the end, it's also good. I have 4 questions for you. So the options here is A, respiratory acidosis uncompensated, metabolic alkalosis uncompensated, respiratory acidosis fully compensated, metabolic alkalosis partially compensated. I will just give you maybe 10 seconds to go through the case once more. Then I will take you to the answer. So approach is definitely, first you see the patient situation. Next, I have told you the authentic already, it is authentic. Then you should go through the pH, then PO2, the PO2. So PO2 here, we have already mentioned is normal. So here, the patient is having a fully compensated respiratory acidosis. So we are seeing here the pH is normal, but which is less than 7.4, but the values are parallelly going. So which is why we are mentioning here it is a fully compensated. It is not commonly seen, but definitely this case scenario we have this in our practice. So respiratory acidosis, most common causes like asthma, CNS, depression, all know that. Additionally, remember that there are some conditions of neuropathy, drug infection also can have these conditions. Second question will be a 58-year-old male, a type 2 diabetic admitted in the ICU, a pH of 7.34, a PCO2 of 24, bicarbonate of 20. I am also giving you the values of sodium, potassium and chloride to calculate the anion gap. So just you see here, matching values are here. So definitely it is the values, the pH is low. So what you want to do, it is put it in the plot and see whether it is coming there. The PCO2 is given here. The PO2 may not be available every time, but PCO2 is enough for us. The bicarbonate level is here. So what is the inference? So where do you want to put it? How it is normal? So also put it in the curve. So what are the options? Here option A, B, C and D. So the answer to this is option B. It is a metabolic acidosis. The person is having the values of high anion gap metabolic acidosis. It is partially compensated, which means that here the values of PaCO2 is actually coming in this range. So metabolic acidosis, definitely we have to classify it as normal gap and high gap. So in this clinical situation, you want to consider lactic acidosis and diabetic ketoacidosis, renal failure, methanol consumption or ethylene glycol, and the anion gap is definitely high in this case. So a formula, mnemonic by name Kussmaul is used. We all know that for practicing physicians is very tip of the tongue. But to just show you, this is the way in which we usually tell. Clinical features, respiratory features of Kussmaul respiration, the shift of oxygen curve. There can be some condition, hyperkalemia also seen. The myocardial contraction is also affected. The fluid electrolyte replacement is necessary, as dialysis is sometimes needed for renal failure. Restoration of adequate intravascular volume is needed in lactic acidosis. Management of severity, treat the condition, supportive condition. If the cause is established, give it. Only a very select situation we give IV sodium bicarbonate. I already told you that IV sodium bicarbonate is dangerous as well, only if you require when pH is very less than 6.9. Hyperkalemia, sometimes we need to give it to alkaline diuresis indicated in CRF for oral supplementation of bicarbonate is required. The third case with you, 64-year-old lady, left MCA infarct, neurological again, severe dehydration and renal failure. The BH is in the higher side, 7.64. Bicarbonate value is 19. So the CO2 value is 25. So we have to match it with the disorder. So what do you think this is? Whether it is coming in which curve? So we have to take the tic-tac-toe again, where you are going to plot it. So I will give you maybe 10 seconds. Maybe you are by now you may be sure what to go through. So this is the case of respiratory alkalosis. So this is the way in which respiratory alkalosis is definitely picked up. And we can see here in this formula, the pH value is higher side and the values are high, means we have to definitely consider alkalosis. And also remember that when the PCO2 is more than 35, it is alkalosis. So definitely that is a respiratory alkalosis. And definitely we are also seeing that hyperventilation, hyperthyroidism is one of the conditions which also can contribute to this by the thyrotoxicosis. The fourth and final question to you, in a person undergoing bariatric surgery, in this case, the baseline value was required, but curiously, there was a value of pH, the value obtained here when person was vital to undergo. Definitely, the pH value was seen here is 7.55. And what do you think it is? So the options here, again, the PCO2 is higher side. So the pH bicarbonate is also given to you here. So definitely, what do you think it is? Whether it is metabolic or respiratory alkalosis, or whether it you can go. So this is typically a case of a straightforward case, because aggressive suctioning, vomiting, dehydration can contribute. One important condition we have to exclude is by mentioning the urine chloride value. In this case, is low. Definitely, it points out to that. Endocrine conditions are also there. Urine chloride is very high, more than 20. Diuretic exposure, hypokalemia, conditions like Conn syndrome, Cushing syndrome can come into this. Urine chloride, if sent, is very useful to identify the conditions in this. So I will take you to my last few slides. This is the acid-based nomogram. So the tic-tac-toe is basically derived from this nomogram. So respiratory acidosis, whether it is mixed, whether it is metabolic acidosis, depends on the coming to the left side. Here the metabolic alkalosis, mixed value, the buffer line is there, and this is a very useful thing in a clinical practice, because we cannot escape the ABG learning in our practice. So final concluding remark from me. So it is not easy to interpret ABG in clinical practice unless you go stepwise in authentic or not, pH, PO2, PCO2, compensation. Ultimately, when you know the anion gap is there, also calculate other parameters. So by these slides, I want to thank you for the kind attention. I think I have also learned a lot while preparing this complex topic. You are always free to correct me if I have made any mistakes. You can follow me on Twitter, on Monty Dot, and also mail me if you require the slides for future. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shubhankar, for the opportunity. Thank you, audience, as well.
Thank you, Mohan. That was really very exhaustive, and I hope our participants would have gained from it. It is, of course, difficult, as I've already said, and it's a vast topic to cover in a relatively short time. It could have actually done justice if we had allotted 2.5 hours at least. But nonetheless, here we are, and we as usual, we have questions in our chat box. So one for you, Shinai, Mohan.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Das hasn't identified the first name. So this is interesting. Do you think ABG reports may not be reliable when patient is on supplemental oxygen or high ventilation support?
Yes, sir, I
I mean,
already mentioned briefly, sir. When you have some reports which are confusing, we also have to assess the requirement of oxygen. We have to mention there. I agree to you, sir. Some conditions we repeat ABG often, we may get mistaken if the patient is on ventilator. High oxygen requirement, the lung also can injure if you have a high oxygen requirement. Definitely, it requires to be clinically interpreted. As I had already told, oxygen saturation, the oxygen carrying capacity of the hemoglobin is the one which determines. So we also have to calculate the hemoglobin value if it's available. So holistic management. So if you don't go by just the ABG, I have taken step by step. It is very painstaking if you do systematic, but if you have practicing it daily, it's often easy. So the ventilated patient high flow oxygen may have other factors also which may involve, but if you have taken care and taken all the precautions to this, it is often useful. You can use serially monitoring, it's very useful.
yes, and these would also be one of the commoner indications for doing the ABG. And so if they are not reliable, then much of the monitoring may not be useful. So as you correctly indicated, if we look at all the data properly, possibly in most cases they are supposed to reflect the overall, not only the oxygenation status but also the acid-base balance in the body. I think Dr. Ashok has put. Would you like to look at the chat box and see? Dr. Ashok, he has given you various for you to work on. You had given them a few practice, so they have given you a practice. Maybe you look at it, and we
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I just saw it. Yes, sir.
So while you look at it, I'll come to Dr. Beatrice. Now, Beatrice, I have always been intrigued by the age of occurrence of prostates, either malignancy or even benign hyperplasia. We know it occurs in the elderly, maybe 60 years plus. And you also have very strongly put forth a case for anti-androgen treatment, whether you shut off the production of androgen or you block the action of androgen at the level of receptors. So it sounds sort of logical that these should be related to androgen levels. But if that be the case, then we should have seen the highest levels of prostate hyperplasia or prostate cancer in the mid-20s, where the androgen levels are highest in males. Why do you think?
Very interesting. I don't know the exact reason. Probably what I would say is probably aging also adds on to the mutations later. So
absolutely, absolutely. At least the malignancy part, I think we can put down to the DNA changes, that what happens to aging related to various factors. But the benign prostate hyperplasia, while that should also be occurring at the older age group, we do not know. Maybe it's the androgen to estrogen ratio or something that determines. Now, so Dr. Pankaj Singhania would has a question: if GnRH antagonists, okay, if GnRH antagonists are better than GnRH agonists, then why aren't they used more widely? And it's true, as endocrinologists, we tend to use much less of these antagonists. Those in the business of the gynecologists, essentially, who run artificial reproduction techniques, they tend to use more of GnRH antagonists as well.
So the issue is with the compliance with the patients. One is that we have more experience with the GnRH agonists till now. And the second is that it causes more injection site reactions, and it's supposedly as high as 40%. So the patients tend to discontinue it. So that is probably the most important reason why we don't stick on to GnRH antagonist as compared to GnRH agonists.
Yep. Probably, maybe the usage will increase if definitely we can demonstrate that the efficacy is better. And this Dr. Akash Panigrahi, who has put forth a very practical question, and that extends from what you've already mentioned about skin reaction, skin abscess, and injection site abscess. So this does happen with GnRH agonists injections, especially the long-acting ones that we use. You can have injection site aseptic abscesses. So how do you get over this problem?
So it's not so common with the GnRH agonists, and we have experience with using it in the precocious puberty. And personal experience, limited experience, but I have not seen any of this aseptic abscess. One thing is to dissolve the powder if it comes in the powder form. You dissolve it properly and inject it at room temperature. It's sterile technique, so I don't think it should be an issue.
Yeah, but it does happen, and sometimes I have seen changing the brand has helped. Leuprolide going over to triptorelin, this has helped. Whether subcutaneous versus intramuscular, there is a difference I have not noticed, but maybe if more often, I mean, sometimes that would also help. But I've seen that changing from leuprolide to triptorelin. I mean, more experience actually with me is with leuprolide, and sometimes I've had to change over to triptorelin. And then a very interesting question from Dr. Singhania. He says it's androgen deprivation and option in conditions associated with higher male mortality. So I think it's generally accepted that life expectancy is lower in males overall if you have all equal opportunities. Not maybe does not pertain in our society, maybe because we do not yet have proper equality between male and female, but biologically possibly the longevity is more for females. So what he suggests is, of course, he puts 2 and 2 together and suggests that all of the difference is because of androgens in males. So why not use anti-androgens in males? And there's been a lot of talk about hypogonadism in males and needing androgen replacement for improving quality of life. But now we have the opposite question. Can we use anti-androgen in males overall to improve their mortality? This is not directly related to your topic, but it's definitely food for thought for endocrinologists.
I'm not aware of any studies where they have looked at anti-androgen therapy and looked at the longevity, because you do give anti-androgen therapy, but you also will have side effects. So there is no point in increasing the longevity with a poor quality of life.
I suppose that's a sort of immediate practical way of looking at it. And of course, we do not have those studies. And also in the context of the current COVID era, it has repeatedly been shown that males tend to have higher mortality. And so that also, and in fact, I do remember there is, in US, one of the first physicians to die of COVID was Dr. Garvin. And he was a dermatologist, and he had very prominent androgenetic alopecia. And in fact, even it was given a term, Garvin sign. If you look at someone with androgenetic alopecia, then that person is supposed to have worse prognosis in the COVID era as well. But of course, as we do understand that in women also, possibly those with features of higher androgen level possibly did worse. So that brings in sort of an intriguing question as to role of anti-androgens, maybe at least in the sort of selected population of those affected in COVID. Maybe if we have trials, we do not have trials very clearly. but we do understand the androgens overall do have an effect on T cell, and they tend to sort of suppress T cell, helper T cell activity. So predisposition to infection may be more. And on the other hand, androgens tend to have more pro-inflammatory effect. So yes, I mean, there are pluses and minuses, but as you very correctly pointed out, how many men would be happy to have anti-androgen just to prolong their life? I mean, you need to have a quality of life as well, not just the quantity, right? So those are intriguing thoughts, and so maybe Mohan, let me also have a look at it. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So
yes, sir.
So pH is 7.362, so it's less than 7.3.
It's compensated. It's compensated.
So it's normal, right?
It's normal.
But PCO2 is high.
High side.
CO2 is low.
Respiratory. Yes, sir. It looks like more of a respiratory cause, with the metabolic component is very high. The bicarbonate is high. So it's partially getting compensated. Yes, sir. So the thing is that the bypass, I also checked the authenticity of, because the first step is authenticity, because the reports, when I just calculated, it's coming 25. It's a bit higher than what we expect. So maybe the machine also, we also find machines which are not calibrated, because in the COVID times, the technical person is not available for checking the calibration of the machine. Recently, we had a machine which had got lightning had struck here, so we lost that machine. So some issues occur in the electrical technical part, but maybe there is an error in the part which the doctor has kindly sent us. But I definitely feel that there is the metabolic compensation which has occurred, which is the bicarbonate is increased, and respiratory is the major issue. So that's the lung may be the one which is the major cause, and the kidney is trying to get it. So I would like to know the creatinine value, the anion gap, all those things. But you can also see the lactate value is not that problematic.
Right. Yeah,
so we have to consider, because anyway, I think sessions like this, you can definitely try to practically approach such conditions. I think I have also benefited, because the last 2-3 minutes, I was also trying to put my tic-tac-toe in place. So I think it's a very, very good question. Thank you, sir, for that question.
Yeah, and the other issue is that arterial blood gas analysis, what you've been asked to discuss about, but as we know, many times we do venous blood gas analysis, because arterial is technically much more challenging, and maybe and also the side effects tend to be more. So we also need to be aware that so far as the pH is concerned, so far as the bicarb is concerned, so far as even the PCO2 is concerned, the difference between arterial and venous is quite small, and most of the time we can do with venous blood gas analysis itself. The pH is less in venous blood, but maybe by 0.03, 0.04, something like that, right?
Yes, sir.
Of course, the PO2 is the one which makes significant difference. So I think we did have a very interesting and learning session this evening, and it's we tend to get overwhelmed looking at figures, but if we approach it in the way that Dr. Mohan has correctly shown, we can most of the time make good use of the ABG value or even the VBG value, and provide useful information, and use that for treatment of our patients. And in the context of endocrine disorders also, he has also correctly pointed out various ABG abnormalities, especially primarily related to acid-base disturbances, which can be helpful in our diagnosis. So I think it's not possible to provide an overall sort of conclusion or summary, because the two talks were so different. But I think it was very interesting, and I would like to thank both of the speakers for taking their time out. And And I'm told once again on this evening also, we had more than 1,000 participants trying to learn from both of your excellent talks.
Thank you, sir. Very good. Very good.
Thanks to all the participants as well for joining in on this Saturday evening. And of course, as every time, I can't thank the Intas team, too much, because the entire team has been putting a lot of effort in getting this across to a large section of our physician audience. So back to Dr. Mithilesh Nayak and to the Intas team. And thank you once again. All of you stay safe and well, though the COVID status seems to be getting better overall in the country, but it's not all gone, and we should still keep up our guards. Yes, over to Intas.
Thank you, sir. It was a wonderful journey so far, and we have learned so many things in the Practice Pulse in endocrinology. And I would like to thank Dr. Subhankar Chaudhary, sir, for providing us continuous guidance in planning and executing this webinar series, Practice Pulse in endocrinology. I would also like to thank Dr. Beatrice and for her excellent deliberation on topic endocrine manipulation in breast and prostate cancers. I would also like to thank Dr. Mohan Sinha for sparing his valuable time and providing us valuable clinical insight on EBG reports, assessment of EBG reports. I would also like to thank all the participants who have participated today and also who have participated in all our past conference or all past webinars on the Practice Pulse in endocrinology. I would like to also make one announcement here that, as you all aware, that we are parallelly running multiple webinar series which will enhance the clinical practice of practicing clinicians. So from this Wednesday on 21st July, we are starting another webinar series, Practice Pulse, or we can say Spotlight on Chronic Kidney Disease. And we have two exciting topics to discuss in this session under the guidance of Dr. Babu Francis. The first topic is kidney function measurement, what is known and what is new, by Dr. Roy Bansal from New Delhi. And the second topic is therapeutics for diabetic kidney disease, conventional versus newer approach, by Dr. Sonal Dharan, nephrologist from Ahmedabad. And we will also update you with regards to next sessions on Practice Pulse in endocrinology. So with this, I once again thank you all, and good night, everyone.